very much, and thank you very much to Christine and Andrew for inviting me to come down to speak here at Kane's Library. As Christine suggested, this talk will hopefully build quite nicely on that first talk by Ari Gilbert, especially because it has been quite tough even just finding the very few numbers of theosophical periodical titles in Scotland. Even in particular libraries, sometimes they don't hold entire runs of it, and you have to work between university libraries to get a whole collection put together. Okay, so as you can see from the title, what I'm going to discuss today is the Theosophical Press in Scotland, and I'm interested in looking at Theosophy here today because there were a number of theosophical periodicals that emerged in late 19th and early 20th century Scotland. And I think it's especially pertinent to consider these at this event, as some of them were intended for more elite audiences and others for more popular audiences. So they give us a sense of some of the tensions around popular occulture during the occult revival. And I think it's interesting to look at Scotland's theosophical periodical specifically, because as I outline in my chapter for Christine and Andrew's book, there was a particular culture of theosophy that developed in Scotland in this period, which has been widely neglected by critics. Scottish theosophists went to great lengths to gain their own national section of the Theosophical Society, distinct from what was sometimes called the British section. And this distinct section created a different culture that requires attention on its own terms. One of the striking features of Scottish theosophy is how closely linked it is to the Celtic Revival, and to the Scottish Celtic Revival in particular, which was allied in many ways to the Irish Celtic Revival, but also quite distinct. And I'd like to suggest in this paper that Celticism became a key means of bridging the gap between the more elite and the more popular periodical titles and audiences in Scotland, a way of creating some form of unity for this national section. So in order to place these periodicals in context, I'll give a kind of potted history of the Theosophical Society in Scotland. I'm aware it might not be one of the topics that you're more familiar with, so it's useful to go over the society itself and also some of the key figures who were involved in the society. And from there, I'll outline the particular periodicals that developed in Scotland, some elite, some popular, and consider the role that the Celtic Revival played, outlining how Celticism became a unifying trope for the Theosophical Society in Scotland. So, the history of the society. In 1884, the first lodge of the Theosophical Society was established in Scotland, so 9 years after the Theosophical Society had first been set up in New York. This lodge in Edinburgh was known as the Scottish Lodge, and it was opened by Henry Steele Olcott, who of course co-founded the Theosophical Society with Blavatsky in New York. The lodge's motto was not the most pithy, but here it is. Criticize criticism alone. Deny nothing save denial. Be intolerant of intolerance, thus kill out separateness and affirm the law of brotherhood. The final line, of course, is a reference to that key tenet of theosophy, universal brotherhood. And the first line forms an attack on the idea of criticising other religions. The Scottish Lodge really tried to prioritise seeing itself as a space of religious hybridity and tried to bring together as many different ideas and religions as possible. The first president of the lodge was a man named Robert Cameron, who died unfortunately not long into his presidency, and he was followed by George Dixon, who was later a Golden Dawn initiate, who was also president for a very brief period. And after this, the president of the society for a long period of time was John William Brodie Innes, who was a writer as well as an occultist and a key ally of MacGregor Mather in the Golden Dawn. Brodie Innes was instrumental in forming the Scottish Lodge and maintaining its independence from the British or European section, and he remained president of it for most of the 1890s, while also playing the role of Imperator, or Chief of Edinburgh's Golden Dawn Temple, Amen-Ra, from 1893. In 1891, the magazine Lucifer reported that the Scottish Lodge is, quote, a decidedly strong body, numbering perhaps more professional men than any other lodge in the United Kingdom, appealing especially to men of science and intellect. So perhaps a suggestion there of as being quite an elite group. And to the displeasure of Alcott, the Scottish Lodge was a private lodge limited to a particular coterie. Although the lodge tried to style itself as accessible to all who seek us, that's one of the quotes from the editorials, it clearly attracted an elite gathering, and consequently there was a demand for a more open alternative branch to Theosophy in Scotland. An Edinburgh branch was established just in 1892, and it was for beginners, as it was said. So again, trying to reach out to a wider populace. And an article in Lucifer read, "Should anyone think that the meetings of the Scottish Lodge partake too much of the drawing room character, this cannot be said of the Edinburgh branch." Popularity for the Theosophy movement gradually increased in Scotland over the 1890s. Scotland was even subject to an American Theosophical crusade in this period to expand support. The crusade focused on attacking cities throughout Europe, and Glasgow and Edinburgh were among the cities attacked. These crusaders were met with a particularly frosty reception in Glasgow, where one minister challenged everything that the crusader said and was escorted out of the hall with vehement mutterings. Nevertheless, a Glasgow lodge was chartered in 1900. It was then in 1910 that the most significant theosophical developments occurred in Scotland. In February, 5 new lodges were chartered: the Alcott, Orpheus and Orient lodges in Edinburgh, the Langside Lodge in Glasgow, and the Leven Lodge in Fife. And in the following month, on the 3rd of March in 1910, a charter was issued to form the 17th national section of the Theosophical Society, to be called the Theosophical Society in Scotland, which was headquartered at 28 King Street in Edinburgh, and it still is headquartered there today. The General Secretary was David Graham Pole, who we'll hear more about soon. He was a Fabian and later a Labour MP. Before the national section was established, the Glasgow and Edinburgh lodges had been loosely affiliated to what was either known as the British or European section, while the Scottish Lodge had remained independent. Now all of the lodges were part of this distinctive Scottish section. This section was partly formed for to develop a more, to spread the message of Theosophy more effectively throughout the nation. And on top of that, it then organised a very big propaganda tour just after it was formed. 1,698 people attended lectures on Theosophy in locations of various different, across the nation, I should say, in Kirkcaldy, Dundee, Aberdeen and Dunfermline, so it really was spreading out by this point. Members noted the success of the propaganda tour, and numerous other lectures were planned, including ones to coincide with performances of Wagner's The Ring of Nibelung. The sale of publications is also reported to have been strong in this period too. So after establishing the national sections, Scotland had its first national convention in 1911, which Annie Besant presided over, and during this trip, a lodge in Glasgow it was established in her honour, the Annie Besant Lodge at 17 Queen's Crescent in Glasgow, and this is still a functioning Theosophical Society. Here you can just see Theosophy in Scotland over the door in this image taken from Google Maps. And the Annie Besant Lodge was just one of various lodges formed after the establishment of the national section. Forfar, Musselburgh, Perth lodges, they were all chartered in 1911, and various other centres were established in Aberdeen, Bo'ness, Dundee, Dunfermline, Falkirk, Kirkcaldy, Stirling, Hawick, and various centres throughout Glasgow. So it really was incredibly widespread by this point. So that's a brief kind of overview of what's happening with the Theosophical Society around this period. But I thought I'd also outline some of the key figures that were in play in the Scottish movement and this period. I've already mentioned Graham Pole and Brodie Innes, who were very important figures, but there were also some important artistic figures who were involved too. For instance, one of the members of the Theosophical Society was one of the greatest artists for my money of the period, John Duncan. Duncan was a painter of the Celtic Revival, creating some absolutely incredible paintings that remain part of popular culture today. One of these ones you see on quite a few book covers, John Duncan's The Riders of the Sidhe. I haven't yet actually gone into all of the occult iconography here, but I think you can see from snakes on the top of helmets, there's this sort of overlap, I suppose, between Celtic iconography and occult iconography. And this is a depiction of the Sidhe, which were the Celtic fairy peoples, and Duncan himself believed that he could see these Sidhe. He often wrote in his notebooks about visions that he had. He believed he had this kind of second sight and was able to see the Sidhe at certain occasions, and from those experiences he painted this work. Another great painting that he created, which you can see in the National Gallery of Scotland, is Saint Bride, which portrays the Celtic pagan goddess Bridget here being transported to see Christ. In Scottish mythology, she travels from Iona out to Bethlehem, and Iona was incredibly important for Duncan. He spent a lot of time there, tried to develop a spiritualist community in Iona, and he did various paintings of figures like Columba, who again bridged that Christian-pagan divide, and ritualism, which of course was never far from the occult. Now, Duncan joined the Theosophical Society in Edinburgh in October 1909, but then he transferred his membership to the Orpheus Lodge in Edinburgh upon its creation in 1910, as did his wife, Christine Allen, who you might know about through her friendship with Wellesley Tudor Pole, for instance, and the work she did down in Glastonbury relating to the Grail. And it's unsurprising that he made this transfer to the Orpheus Lodge, because the Orpheus Lodge had a keynote, a kind of focus for discussion, and that was art and drama. So obviously John Duncan was going to be attracted to the Orpheus Lodge. Duncan appears to have maintained his membership to the Theosophical Society until 1945. He certainly contributed to the Theosophical Society in different ways throughout his life. For instance, he was commissioned to execute a cycle of 10 paintings on the life of the Buddha for Ananda College in Sri Lanka, a college established by the Buddhist Theosophical Society and led by Alcott. According to the Scotsman, the India office provided Duncan with resources to execute this cycle. This is just one painting from that cycle called The Dream of Maya. And because the India office were giving resources, this was in 1930, I think it must have been Graham Pole who was involved in getting those resources to him, because Graham Pole was a Labour MP at that point and involved in the India office. I also discovered when I was discussing with members of the Theosophical Society in Edinburgh that Duncan gave one of his paintings to the Theosophical Society as well, one of St. John the Apostle, and the lodge still hold that painting. So it just shows that he had this really strong connection to Theosophy throughout his life. Duncan's probably the most significant artistic figure who was actually a member of the Theosophical Society, but there were other prominent figures in Scottish cultural life who were attracted to Theosophy. The great polymath Patrick Geddes, who Duncan collaborated with on several occasions, took a clear interest in Theosophy. Geddes has been credited with founding the modern discipline of town planning and sociology, while he was also at the core of Scotland's Celtic Revival. He was a sociologist, a conservationist, an art patron, an education reformer. I could go on. He really was a great polymath in the true sense of the word. And due to his many influential town planning and sociological endeavours, critics tend to cast Geddes as a scientific thinker. But as Philip Boardman reminds us, Geddes was both a Western scientist and an Indian mystic, thus well suited to Theosophy, of course, which tried to bring Indian mysticism with science together. Although I haven't found any evidence to suggest he was actually a member of the Theosophical Society, he definitely attended Theosophical lectures, and his interests would no doubt have been further stimulated by his friendship with Annie Besant. Even before the Theosophical Society was established, Geddes had a close relationship to Besant. When studying here in London under T.H. Huxley in London between 1874 and 1878, Geddes tutored Besant in natural science because she was refused entry to University College due to her gender. They maintained a correspondence, and 40 years on, in 1915, when she was president of the Theosophical Society, Besant took Geddes on a motor run to an old temple city in India, Philip Boardman tells us. She also introduced Geddes to Jiddu Krishnamurti, who was head of the Theosophical Society's Order of the Star in the East. Besides Besant and Krishnamurti, Geddes was also friends with another figure connected to Theosophy, Abdul Baha. When Baha came to visit Edinburgh in 1913, he not only attended and addressed the Theosophical Society and contributed tablets to Theosophy in Scotland, he also visited Geddes's Outlook Tower. You might recognise the Outlook Tower. It's just right up at the top of the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, next to the castle. I think it's now the camera obscura of optical illusions, so you can go and visit it. And Baha went to visit this centre, which for Geddes, I mean, it's sometimes thought of as a kind of sociological centre, but Geddes also liked to think of it as a mystic temple. And as part of his town planning work, Geddes also went out to the Middle East to design town plans for Haifa with Baha's authorization. And Geddes even wrote a short essay on his encounter with Baha in Palestine called A Visit to Sir Abdul Baha, which appeared in reality in 1921. There are several other significant cultural figures involved in the Theosophical Society, but I've illustrated Geddes and Duncan just to demonstrate that the key figures of Scotland's Celtic Revival were involved in Theosophy. And the questions that arise here are, did the fact that the Society appealed to major cultural figures create tensions over popularity and exclusivity? And why were these Celtic revivalists so interested in the Theosophical Society in Scotland? Well, I think the periodical press gives us some answers to these questions. So there were three specifically theosophical periodicals that were printed in Scotland around the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In order, these were the Transactions of the Scottish Lodge, which was published between 1891 and 1895. This was then supplanted, or perhaps I should say continued, by occult, scientific and literary papers read at the Scottish Lodge, which is from 1895 to, I think, 1897, but again, I'm not sure we've actually got a complete run of these yet, so it may have gone a little bit further than that. Then from 1910, the longest running periodical emerges, Theosophy in Scotland. So I'll take each of these in turn, introduce some of their characteristic features, and consider both how they spoke to different audiences, elite and popular, but also how both stressed the importance of Celtic revivalism and how it became a unifying focus for the movement. So to begin with the Transactions of the Scottish Lodge, which was published from 1891. This was a periodical that largely reproduced papers and discussions that occurred at the Scottish Lodge in Edinburgh. In each issue, it was released fairly sporadically, but approximately every 2 to 3 months. Unsurprisingly, it was published in Edinburgh, and from what I can work out, only in Edinburgh. But although the Transactions was very much interested in the happenings of this particular lodge, the whole point behind its release was to try and build a bridge between the society and a wider audience, to get more people interested in Theosophy. It was the librarian of the Scottish Lodge, Andrew Petrie Catanach, who would also go on to become a Golden Dawn initiate, who was particularly keen to release the Transactions, which he hoped would help move Theosophy from the exclusive club into a wider public. He was actually a bit of a dissenting figure within the Scottish Lodge. He would go on to support the establishment of the Edinburgh Lodge, which was, as I said, intended for beginners and for a wider audience, and he became the secretary of that lodge. So the very existence of this periodical reflects a desire to move Theosophy into the popular realm, or at least towards it. But that said, the subject of Transactions remains very much highbrow and exclusive, unsurprising considering it was edited by Brodie Innes, who subscribed to a kind of MacGregor Mather style of occultism. And it requires a specialist knowledge to fully engage with it. Many of the talks transcribed in the periodicals focus on Hermeticism and the Kabbalah, and the high numbers of professional scientists who were in the Scottish Lodge, which I mentioned earlier, is reflected in the subject of the talks, with one, for instance, on the atomic weights and their periodic laws, which I understood about 3 words of, I have to say. There were also elaborately illustrated articles, including ones on Egyptian horoscopes or pentacles, and I've given a few examples of illustrations that that we find in the transactions of the Scottish Lodge here. We have the Egyptian zodiac, we have Hindu lunar mansions, and another incredibly complex Egyptian image here, possibly of the zodiac, but I'm not entirely sure. So although it tried to widen the appeal of Theosophy, the transactions of the Scottish Lodge did remain pretty exclusive. As I've mentioned, these transactions then became the occult, scientific and literary papers read at the Scottish Lodge, which was still edited by Brodie Innes. It takes a very similar format with transcriptions of talks given at the Scottish Lodge and on similar subjects, ranging from the occultism of Tennyson to the polarity of Tatwick currents. And I think there are a couple of notable differences between them, nevertheless. One is the title. Notice the fact that it's the occult, scientific and literary papers, and the transactions of the Scottish Lodge is in smaller fonts. So there's kind of relegating the importance of the Scottish Lodge, the particular society, and foregrounding more the themes of the movement. So again, maybe speaking out to people who are more widely interested in science and the occult. But then also key that it's no longer just published in Edinburgh. At this point, as you can see at the bottom, it's also published by George Redway here in London as well. So speaking out again to wider publics and to key occult publishers as well. It's clear that within these more elite publications that there was a very clear interest in Celticism and the Celtic Revival. This slide shows just a couple of talks that were read at the Scottish Lodge. One, the Epistles to the Seven Churches from a Celtic point of view, delivered by a Celtic student, we are told, and the other, Celtic Orientalism compared with other ancient Oriental systems, which was delivered by Brodie Innes himself. And I think we get a sense of why there was such a concern with Celticism in a reflective piece titled The Scottish Lodge, a Retrospect and a Prospect. Here, Brodie Innes writes about the need to encourage the study of Oriental languages, and he hypothesises that this will not be objected to in Scotland, where the abnormal development of the psychic powers in a few rarely gifted individuals has never been questioned, and where mysticism has been in the air and has been one of the characteristics of the race for many centuries. Sorry, I have completely lost my place here. Where have I finished? This is why you should stick to your script and not look up at the PowerPoint at any point. So the notion endorsed by many Celtic revivalists of Scotland as a sacred site of supernatural energy is clearly adopted and endorsed by Brodie Innes here, used to market Theosophy as especially well suited to the Scottish psyche. I should say, I don't think this is all that Scotland offered. Although Scotland was often associated with second sight and prophecy in this period, it was equally associated with science and enlightenment in the 19th century, which were also key to Theosophy. As Brodie Innes states earlier in this essay, the Scottish Lodge humbly endeavours to bridge the gulf between religion and science. And I think Scotland was a good locale, effectively, that befitted Theosophy, known as a site where scientific rigour and mysticism could cohabit. And clearly, that revival of interest in Celtic myths, folklore and identity played a role in shaping the discourse of Scottish Theosophy in this period. So Celticism was key to the more specialist and exclusive Theosophical periodicals in Scotland. But what is clear when we turn to Theosophy in Scotland is that it was equally important for the more popular Theosophical periodicals in Scotland. Following the formation of the national section in 1910, the publication conditions changed. Theosophy had now become a national culture and very popular across the country, and Theosophy in Scotland became the official organ of this wider, now national movement. On a very immediate level, the increased popularity, I think, is reflected in the simpler title of the periodical. The new periodical for the national section was fittingly edited by the General Secretary of the national section, David Graham Pole, who I've mentioned earlier. And here he is seated on the left, and you can see Annie Besant right in the centre of that image. And Graham Pole was deeply committed to Indian home rule, and he penned several books on this topic, including India in Transition and I refer to India. Incidentally, Annie Besant then returned the favour in some way. It's little known, but she actually became an active supporter of the Scottish Home Rule movement following World War I. She spoke at the Scottish Home Rule Association, and that's a talk that I discuss in more detail in the book chapter for Christine and Andrew's book. So what defined Theosophy in Scotland as a periodical? What were the key changes? Well, first, there was a genuine attempt to represent all of the different local groups and societies across Scotland. Each issue is dedicates several articles to reporting on societies from around the country. But besides these articles, there were also reports of affairs from across Europe. It seems to me that a woman called Isabel Pagan, a wonderful name for a theosophist, Isabel Pagan may have acted as a correspondent. She wrote articles on several international events, including theosophical lectures at the Brussels exhibitions and the Munich Congress. Work was printed by the more widely known theosophists internationally too. The first volume of Theosophy in Scotland includes several articles by Besant, for instance, and there are also poems by popular writers who had absolutely no ties to Theosophy, but they're nevertheless included. These included Robert Burns and even Robert Louis Stevenson, who appear in Theosophy in Scotland. On top of this, there were reviews of big events in Scotland from a theosophical perspective, which again helped the movement speak to more popular concerns. For instance, one of the events that was reviewed was one of Patrick Geddes' pageants, the Masks of Ancient Learning, which is a great event in Edinburgh which attracted thousands of spectators. And it's an event which was very true to Geddes' occult interests, and it featured episodes on Indian education, on Egyptian education, and finally on Celtic education. And the fact that Theosophy in Scotland was covering what was in part a Celtic Revival event is telling, because the journal more widely continues the interest in Celticism that we found in the transactions of the Scottish Lodge and the occult, scientific and literary papers. Take, for instance, an article that was written by Brother Atisha called The Future Work of Scotland. And in this article, what we get are very similar lines to those that we found in the more exclusive titles. And I'll quote from this: "In many respects, Scotland is a chosen land. Some of the sacred spots seem still to be alive with the spirit of the old gods and initiates. Let Scotland prepare the way for the Lords of Wisdom. She can do it." Again, Scotland is portrayed here as a particularly spiritual nation, with sacred enclosures where mysticism and occultism have survived modernity. But more than that, it is portrayed as a nation that is in closer communion with the Orient via Celtic culture. As Brother Atisha notes, not only Scotland, but Ireland too, and Wales, when she is once struck with celestial fire, are all capable of penetrating into the deep mysteries of the East, for many Oriental traits still linger in the Celtic minds and ways. We see here how the Celtic nations are used to demonstrate that Western nations could embrace and perform Eastern ideals, a notion which challenged that East-West binary that some occultists in the period were establishing, for instance, Anna Kingsford and Edward Maitland. But although this is a very similar presentation of Celticism to the one we found in Transactions earlier, I think there are some slight differences, which seem to come through in the next quotation. Brother Atisha tells us, "Once more, let there be a great reformation, when the burns will sing the old songs and the mountains glow with beacon lights of the waiting gods, who are now impatiently awaiting the hour of descent. Every son of the old druids and the ancient mysteries speed onward to new and lasting conquests." That reference to the old songs was very much in step with the wider folk revival at the beginning of the 20th century and the popular Celtic revival music of, say, Marjorie Kennedy Fraser. A stress on every son of the old druids is important too. It is a broad national appeal, vague as well. And it contrasts quite starkly with the beginning of that quote from Transactions, where we are told that the psychic powers reside in a few rarely gifted individuals, quite different from this sense of something more popular that is appealing to everyone in the nation, and a national sense of mysticism. Just to very quickly round up here, what I want to suggest is I think that the reason that both of these types of periodicals are looking to Celticism and drawing from Celticism is that they can, because the Celtic Revival itself was equally divided between a very elite form and a very popular movement. This is one of the periodicals that Geddes released, which has many different occult facets to it, called the Evergreen. Now, as you can see, it's printed in leather. It's incredibly detailed, but at the same time, it was Geddes who was saying that art should be more democratic, and Celtic art could help make art become more democratic. So the Celtic Revival had this tension too, and I think that's part of the reason why there is this close alignment between Theosophy and the Celtic Revival. They're both experiencing those tensions, and that the more elite Theosophists can look to the more elite Celtic culture, and the more popular Celtic Theosophists can look to the more popular Celtic culture. I think I'm out of time this, so I think I'll just leave it on that for now. Okay, cheers.